From the liberal Northeast comes a lone voice of truth. Honest commentary in dishonest times. Think deeper with Juan Newsom. This is the Cure Radio Program. This is the Cure.
So folks, today on The Cure we have a very special guest, Jonathan Henderson. He's an entrepreneur, a master of multiple streams of income, and he's an author. He has a book out. It's called Common Sense, a 2020 Perspective. You can get it on Amazon, and please order that thing up, man, because it's hot. I mean, it's very, very cutting edge, and it's common sense. These are common sense principles and guidelines that most of us on the conservative side of the aisle subscribe to. So John, thanks for being here today, man. Thanks for coming.
Thanks for having me.
Man, before we get to your book, man, what is going on in Washington, D.C.?
I don't know. Somebody named Brandon is super popular.
We got inflation. Afghanistan pullout was a disaster. I mean, see, this is what happens when you elect somebody that's not a problem solver. Case in point.
Yeah, and I mean, why didn't we learn that lesson when he was the 2IC under the last guy that did not do so well, right?
I have no idea, man.
I'm still trying to figure out how he got that many so-called votes and that many people supported him against the guy that issued mean tweets but still managed to keep us out of any new wars, did more for foreign policy than any president that I've seen in my lifetime as far as maintaining America First relations with around the globe and ensuring that we had a good answer for our economy, for our just basic functionality as a nation, It's the difference between a businessman and a politician.
Yeah, I definitely, the genius, the thing about Trump, the thing about Trump is, he was a problem solver, the total opposite of Joe Biden.
Right.
And, his policies were genius. I mean, they were totally ingenious. I was very impressed with his Middle East peace policy, and I read the white paper, and it was just things that should have been done years ago, and he pretty much in his Middle East peace policy, he married economic policy with foreign policy, with military policy, and the thing about that policy, it was Israel based, it was, and because of it, Israel has allied themselves with other nations in that region. When you look at his domestic policies, the deregulation agenda that he had, which, helped it pretty much breathed life into the economy. And when you look at the tax cuts, and he was just very business savvy, very business friendly, just never, even though he only got to serve one term, in terms of his accomplishments, he accomplished more in that one term than most presidents, I think, had in their two terms.
While being impeached twice and receiving nothing but obstruction and hatred from the usual suspects on the left.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. It saddens me that, a lot of people, his accomplishments weren't highlighted. It was just really a demonstration, the demagoguery from the left, from the Democrats in the Congress, and just the hatred, the venomous hatred that came from the mainstream media.
Right.
And, that was pretty much that was the highlight of his presidency. It wasn't, all of the things that we just listed and discussed. Moving the embassy to Jerusalem.
Right.
Record African American unemployment, record Latino unemployment. Record. Women's unemployment hit a 60-year low. Like things like that weren't highlighted, and we're paying for it right now. We're missing them.
And what's amazing is that the majority of the country is so caught up in foolishness that they don't make the connection that if people are working, there is forward progress, right?
Mm-hmm.
You don't make forward progress by throwing tantrums and being the bully and always forcing people to accept whatever you say, no matter what it is you say, right?
Yep.
And,
Exactly.
and so if we don't understand that as adults, there's no way we can lead this nation and move forward with an actual focus on stability, security, strength as a nation, and building up an American people that takes care of one another instead of, everybody's out for self and just looking how they can get over on the next person. And it's just a horrible mentality. And with cancel culture, I'm putting together. I don't want to ruin the movie of this podcast here, but I'm putting together my next venture is actually putting together clothing lines and other accessories that accentuate common sense, conservatism, and those kind of messages.
That's
and,
amazing.
And one of the things that I'm working on for a T-shirt that I will wear, I'm not sure if anybody else has the courage to wear it, but I'm going to put kind of like a sketch drawing of the KKK during one of their lynchings, right? Flames in the background, everybody's in hoods and all this stuff. And on blood red letters on the front, I'm going to put cancel culture, the Democrat legacy. Because cancel culture is nothing more than digital lynching in the modern era.
It is.
Okay?
It is.
What do? As soon as you disagree with the horde of people that think they know what's best for everybody else, they try to cancel your job. They try to cancel you on social media. They try to destroy your life. They run you into the ground. They do everything they can to destroy your life. It's still lynching. They're just not hanging you from a rope in a tree anymore. But that is the Democrat legacy. Because if you go back and look at the lynchings that the Democrats did, they were always lynching people who ran afoul of their agenda, people who did not agree with them. They lynched Republicans, especially black Republicans that ran for Congress. And so that's always been their shtick. They're still just killing people. They're just doing it from a different angle.
Yeah, they did it to Clarence Thomas. I'll never forget that. I will never forget that. How you have a black Joe Biden. Joe Biden. Joe freaking Biden. How you have a black man who is as accomplished and as intelligent and thoughtful as Clarence Thomas. I mean, you ever read some of this guy's opinions? I mean, this guy he's the most brilliant justice on that court. And just to have, them lynch this guy, and that's the way, I mean, that pretty much set the tone for them lynching, he called it himself. Kavanaugh.
Right. They did the exact same tactics with Kavanaugh.
Yep.
And they tried to do it again with somebody else. Who was it? Yeah, so every time they see someone who's a threat to the nonsense that they spew, you got to give them credit. They know how to organize and marginalize and destroy other people en masse because they understand mob mentality and emotional appeal. Right? I mean, they really are. Democrats are the villagers with the pitchforks and torches. All right, that's who they are. And they've made those accusations. They've accused the right of being the racist, of being the ignorant, of being all these things. When you talk to a conservative person, you talk facts, you talk science, you talk math, you talk economics. You talk about things that actually have a basis in reality and have a bottom line that everyone can look at and grasp and understand once they understand processes and due process and the things that matter. When you talk to a leftist, it's always about an emotional appeal, and the moment you disagree with them, it becomes a personal attack against you. They're trying to undermine you and destroy you and catch you off guard. Hey, I think the sun's shining today. You're a racist. Wait, what? Okay. And Republicans used to be these radical people that were the abolitionists of old that really fought to get this nation on track, to overcome slavery, to do what was right for the betterment and the freedom of everyone in this nation. And somewhere along the line, Republicans lost their spine. And
Mm-hmm.
that's the saddest indictment that I can make in the current political climate, is that we have a bunch of people that sit on Capitol Hill and within the states, and they don't stand up to these temper tantrum throwing brats and
Mm-hmm.
say, shut up, that's enough, sit down until you can come back with facts. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
And we don't have the people that stand up and look these people in the eye and say, I'm done listening to you because you have no understanding of reality, and what you say is absolute garbage.
It is a sad commentary for the Republican Party.
Hmm.
They haven't really stood for anything since Newt Gingrich was Speaker. As a party, as a whole, I remember that, and I remember Newt Gingrich and the Contract of America, and they got a lot of things done
Right.
because they were in unison under a conservative vision,
Correct.
and the leadership that's in the House and in the Senate now, they do not align that way under a
No.
conservative vision. And now Donald Trump came
Right.
in between 2016 and 2020 and gave them a spine, and they started to kind of sort of stand up to the status quo, but
Yeah, but
that
only a
was
few
really
of them
Trump.
still.
Only a few of them.
Yeah, because there were a lot of them that were doing their best to undermine him or just play the ignoring the problem card, right?
Yep.
So they would just turn a blind eye, look the other way, and say, "Oh, is that vote today? Oh my God, I didn't know," right?
Yep.
But Republicans for a long time have lost their spine. We started losing our spine when we let the Dixiecrat folks, Strom Thurmond and those kind. There's only like two or three of them that actually migrated over and claimed to be Republican. But we did the same thing again in 2008 with all these libertarians and independents that
Mm-hmm.
came over, and they're still flying the flags of the Confederate South, claiming to be conservative.
Mm-hmm.
Now,
Mm-hmm.
you backtrack us 120 years, there is not a single Republican on earth that would let that flag fly anywhere near their camp because we went to war to fight against the very people that flew that flag,
Yep.
right?
That's
We've
true.
lost our purpose, we've lost our vision, we've lost our standards, and we've let these people that are just radical rebels that really have no allegiance to any kind of party and certainly not the country. All they promote is freedom, but they don't
Mm-hmm.
promote morality, they don't promote responsibility, they don't promote accountability. All they care about is being free to do whatever they want at everyone else's expense. And we
Mm-hmm.
have somehow let those folks latch onto the Republican Party, and they're parasitic in nature, and it discredits everything else that the Republicans should and could be standing for.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
we have to clean up our own as well because we've allowed too much crap to fester around what we should be standing for. And
Metastasize.
oh my goodness, well, everyone's always told me, John, you always win more flies with honey than vinegar, right? And
Mm-hmm.
I said, and I always make the observation, having grown up on farms in Indiana, yeah, but you get the most flies. That's bullshit.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? Because flies are attracted to crap. And as long as you allow crap to hang around you and issue that smell and provide that breeding ground for the flies and their maggots and everything else that they produce, you're always going to draw more crap flies to you than if you're actually speaking the truth. And so you should stick with the vinegar and let that purify the process no matter what the results are, right?
Amen, brother.
So, yeah, so we have to do a much better job of simply saying your ideals must align with X, and if they do not do that, then you are not truly conservative nor Republican. And if you cannot modify the way that you think by basic understanding and facts and instilling virtue in these people, right? That's the biggest thing. You'll notice that in my
Yep.
book.
Yep.
The one thing that we're missing from a common sense equation across the board is virtue. We,
Standards.
that's right. We've got to have that virtue in those standards and have the ability to critically think so that we can process the information that's out there because it's all out there, right?
Yep.
There's nothing new under the sun when it comes to especially common sense. But
Yep.
somehow we've let the people that know the least and have the loudest voices become the talking heads for everyone in America, and that's just the wrong answer.
Yeah, just like my head explodes when I hear something about climate change. I don't want to hear about no doggone climate change. I mean, it
Yeah,
just that just we've allowed
yeah,
climate change to dominate the conversation on a national level,
right.
and the thing is a total hoax. I mean, I
Well,
think
I love Elon Musk's approach, right? UN, the food bill, it would take 6 billion to solve world hunger. Send me a plan, I'll fund it. Okay. I think the same approach towards climate change is mandatory at this point, okay? If unless you can propose to me a solution that eliminates, let's say, the islands of plastic floating waste off the coast of China, or
Yep.
the things that we know are wrong in our environmental controls and constraints, unless we're going to penalize companies for dumping their wastewater and toxic water into our groundwater supply systems, if we're not going to impose penalties that legitimately shut a problem down, if we're not going to resolve the things that are out there, if we're not going to fund innovation that helps to recycle and reuse those plastics out there instead of just letting them just float around and tying them together,
Mm-hmm.
if you're not talking solutions to me, I don't want to hear what you have to say, because
Yeah.
you're not talking about anything other than sending more money to DC or to the global conglomerate elites that
Mm-hmm.
funds them and their jets while they travel around talking about saving the planet, but nobody does anything to actually do to fix the problems,
Exactly.
right?
Exactly. There's
So,
no critical thinking when it
what's
comes
the
to.
solution?
There's no solution because there's no critical thinking.
Well, I can
Um,
give them solutions. They don't want to talk to me though.
I know you can, and look, there's a lot of, the whole. There's a whole misconception that conservatives don't care about the environment. We care a lot about the
That's
environment.
that's patently false if you understand the Republican Party. Teddy Roosevelt was a Republican president that instituted all of the national parks we have today.
Exactly.
Conservatism, conservation, it's in our name,
Yep.
right? Conservatives are the true pres- pre- um, preservationists of the environment. That's always been our thing that we do, and we do it with smart business practices, and we do it with legitimate, logical legislation that, yes, it impacts certain people that are doing the wrong thing, but that's who we're supposed to be impacting with legislation to begin with. If you're
Conserv.
doing the wrong thing, then you deserve to be penalized, right?
Yep.
Right. I mean,
Conservatives created the EPA.
that's correct. That is correct, right? But Teddy Roosevelt, Mr. Rough Rider himself, is the one that dedicated all of the national parks across the United States for the simple preservation of our natural habitat and our natural state as Americans, right? And
Absolutely
so,
right.
so that's a Republican invention. That is a conservative right-wing thing that we need to latch onto and say, look, leftists, you don't own any part of this because you're the ones that have all these ridiculous demands but zero solutions. There's no reason to talk to you about this until you come to the table with solutions.
They'll hijack it, just like with the EPA.
That's okay.
Nixon
Let,
created the EPA, and then
that's it.
when
Yep.
Democrats get in office, they'll go into the EPA, and then
Yep.
they'll start regulating and having all of these strict standards.
But
Um,
all of their sycophants always say that Democrats clean up Republican messes. Okay. So
that's
our
farce.
retort, of course it's a farce. We know that, but we have to prove it now because the spineless people in D.C., minus the Ted Cruzes and the Jim Jordans and the Tom Cottons and the other folks that actually stand up and say this is crap, we're not doing this.
Hmm.
We
Hmm.
have to stand up with a unified voice and say, put your solutions on the table. You don't get to talk to me about money until you talk to me about a solution, so I know how to scope the cost, right?
Hmm.
And if we don't have that kind of voice unified across the nation that says this is right, this is wrong, and this is what we expect in the future for all discourse, right? We got to be the adults in the equation and hold the screaming children, the baby killers, and the idiots out there accountable for everything they say and say, if you don't put solutions on the table, you're not worth talking to.
Yep. Absolutely. That's
Because
absolute.
everyone talks about meeting in the middle, right? Well, the middle is solutions. And once you have a solution, you can scope it and figure out how to fund it. We have entire government agencies, plus every business owner in America that knows how to do a CBA, a cost benefit analysis. Sorry, I need to define my acronyms. A cost benefit analysis and figure out what something is going to cost, to include overruns, to include unforeseen circumstances, and figure out what a good solution looks like and then implement it. You don't get anywhere by sitting on your hands debating it for 10 years. You have to
Hmm.
step
Hmm.
up and say, all right, here's phase one, let's get going.
I've always said, John, that there need to be the problem in DC. Too many damn lawyers, um,
And lobbyists.
and lobbyists, but mainly it's the lawyers. And lawyers don't really know how to problem solve. They don't.
No,
They
they know how.
create more problems than they
Yeah,
than they
well,
actually solve.
correct, because they're always looking for the risk assessment and the risk mitigation factors that lead to liability and lawsuits, right?
Yep.
So that they play scared because that's their nature, because that's their career, right? So when you have corporate lawyers and people that operate out of a sense of fear, they're going to give you answers that are based in fear.
They, I've always said that in Washington D.C. we need more people who have worked with their hands.
Correct.
People who have worked for a living, blue collar people, white collar people too, but blue collar people that have worked with their hands. People that are
the Ed Durs of the world.
Yeah, the common sense.
The truckers that win with a $153 campaign. You know, when I was out in Washington State and was looking at running for office, you know, a decade ago, I was told that that kind of a scenario could never happen, that I have to have this huge war chest and a lot of supporters and everything else. And I sat back and watched this campaign. It was New Jersey, right?
Yep, New Jersey.
And so Ed Durr wins with $153, and I think his total campaign with his advisors and everything else was like $2,500 max, right?
Yep.
And I'm like, that is the gold standard for how every single political campaign should be run. It's not about the money; it's about what you stand for. Yep. And if you don't stand for something positive for every American, that at least the ones that have sense, then you shouldn't be running for office.
Sweeney is gone, and thank God.
Yeah.
He was terrible, man.
Yeah, that's your stomping ground. So yeah, that's a fantastic win for you guys. Just in the fact that it rocked the boat, right?
Yep.
And we have to get on board with rocking the boat across the nation, right? I mean, because these people that are standing up, the Greg Abbotts, the Kristi Noems, there's a Democrat governor, Kansas, I think, that just sent back, we're not complying to the mandate law to Biden, right?
Yep.
And I have a tremendous amount of respect for Tulsi Gabbard, right?
Yep, absolutely.
She's a Democrat, but she calls it right down the line, right?
Yes, she does.
And those are the kind of Democrats that actually are worth working with, okay? The Ocasio-Cortezes and the Squad and all the extreme people that are just out there that do not really understand reality and the consequences of their choices, they are not worth dealing with at all, right?
Yeah,
and they're
you
tenacious.
Can't even take them serious. You can't take them serious.
And the thing is that they gain credibility by being tenacious and asking a whole bunch of questions, but they're not putting a whole lot of solutions on the table.
Yeah,
okay?
They don't have any.
And when they do, it's always about the money. The Green New Deal is solely about money. It's never about proven practices that actually work, right? And there is no backup plan if you prove that windmills and electric vehicles and all that stuff don't work. What's your default? What do you jump back to once those things don't pan out for you, right? So how are we making things smarter, but also a means of providing legitimate solutions that can be challenged through scientific analysis, the scientific method, right? It's always subject to challenge, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And if you're not using that approach to implement things that have a major level impact on our environment, on our culture, on our economics, and on the people of this nation, if you haven't considered all those points in the platform, you haven't begun to think about the problem.
Yeah, definitely.
You just want to exacerbate it and get paid in the process.
Definitely. I always, and places like New York can cook up in an Alexandria, Ocasio-Cortez.
Yeah.
And, it baffles me, a city in New York, which used to be, back in the day, New York was, pretty conservative itself. Over time, morphed into the socialist hellhole that it is today.
Yeah, there's a phenomenon that I talk about that in part in my book. It's the collectivist versus the individual, right? Yep. The more people you have in an area, the more problems you have. And the more problems those people have, the larger they seem when they impact a greater amount of people. So when you're looking at the total scope of how we engage things as a society, the majority of our problems stem and start in New York and LA. Tell me I'm wrong.
No, you're not wrong at all.
Okay. The third worst city, Chicago.
Yep, Illinois.
Okay.
Three states that are gone and not competitive by
right, but Chicago is another one that around the city it's absolutely horrible, but outside of that, in the rest of Illinois, it's more or less conservative or middle of the road. Okay. Yeah. Minneapolis, Minnesota, another fine example of the city creating the problems for the rest of the state. I lived in Washington for 15 years. Seattle and Olympia are the armpits of the state, and everybody else is conservative, right? Detroit, Portland, okay? Everywhere you have a consolidation of people, life gets easier They find more things to complain about, but the groupthink mentality prohibits them from actually implementing solutions that better the whole, and then the whole takes on a worse and worse approach and vision until they become self-defeating and collapse from within. And as soon as you introduce something as ridiculous as immorality to the equation, they're done,
Mhm.
right? You
Mhm.
got more people worried about whether they're male or female or one of the 107 genders that they're making up instead of actually solving for the problems in this nation, right? How lost are we as a nation?
Man, we are lost. I mean, we are lost. I mean, in those inner
Yeah.
city areas, they keep people together. Um,
Well, they
you
put them
know,
into public housing.
put
Okay.
them in public
They
housing,
subsidize their living expenses. They
and
take
then,
away their transportation. They
yep,
take away their Second Amendment rights. You can't own guns in the city, right?
yep,
They
yep,
make you dependent and wards of the state, and they funnel you all in there like a bunch of sheep in a pen, and then say, whatever you need, we're your saviors. That's the Democratic Party mantra, okay?
yep.
That
That's absolutely.
I don't know if you know the history of the Democratic Party. Founded in 1828, but it was founded by the people who forced us to have the three-fifths compromise in our Constitution. Okay,
Mhm.
the ones who wanted to count slave votes, but they were going to make sure they rode with whip and gun and every means of coercion they could to make those slaves vote exactly the way that they wanted, so they could have the numbers. Okay, that's how
Absolutely.
the three-fifths compromise was instituted. It wasn't about making people less than human. It was about moderating votes that were forced and coerced by slave masters, right?
Yep. Absolutely.
Fast forward to 1828 and then up through 1850, the Democratic Party was the champion of every single initiative to keep slaves, to build trade around slaves, and to make that entire paradigm something that was part of United States culture. Not too many people know this. I did the homework in my book. By 1804, slavery was completely outlawed in the North. It was illegal.
Yeah, it
Okay,
was. They started immediately in Vermont and in
that's
places
correct.
in the
Yep.
north.
The last
Right
state
away, as
was
soon
done
as
in
the
1804. Yep.
Constitution was ratified, they started.
1779 was the first state to get rid of slavery. That was Vermont, right?
Yep.
And so then if you look at the census actually collected the data on who the citizens were. In 1840, there were still slaves that were listed as slaves in the North, but that was because their masters did not turn them out into the economy without first training them and educating them, make sure they had a place to go, right?
Mhm.
So by 1850, there were no more slaves on the books. You look at 1860, and after the Lincoln Douglas debates and everything else, the South was still pushing to maintain slaveholding states. And the South Carolina Charter for Secession, which is under the Yale Avalon Project, if you Google that, it's all written right there in their history. The first paragraph of the South Carolina Charter for Secession explicitly states that the reason for secession was to remain a slaveholding state. And then they go down the list of grievances that they had with northern states, which included the North's uh, failure to return escaped property.
Mhm.
So when you tell me
Absolutely.
how property can have legs and get up and run away, let me know. Tell me what kind of property that is, right? So their entire premise for seceding, and then they acted against the North when Lincoln sent resupply to Fort Sumter. They fired on the fort. Two people died the next day in incidental fire and accidents. Okay,
Mhm.
and so that was the beginning of the war. The South initiated hostilities after seceding from the Union because they wanted to remain slaveholding states. And you have all these Southern folks that say, well, that's my heritage. I'm flying this flag because of blah, blah, blah. Okay, there's no heritage there. The heritage is one of slavery because the two people that were responsible for flying those flags, Jefferson Davis and General Lee, both made statements after the war that said it is best that we put away those symbols of our division in order to reunite the country.
Yep.
Okay?
Yep.
So when the people that had the most to gain by flying those flags say, you know what, party's over, put it away, let's come back together as a nation, no one in the modern day has a right to sit up there and say, well, that's my heritage. Yeah, it's not. You lost. Okay, I'm a northern boy. All right, you guys lost. Suck it up, Buttercup. Move on and have a better heritage that includes being part of the nation again.
Yep. Yep.
So,
Absolutely.
but the thing that
Absolutely.
people don't understand is all of that's democratic.
Yeah. Yeah.
Those were all Democratic Party actions. They were all led by Democrats. And another thing that people don't understand is that there were Republicans in the South from 1848 when the Republican Party was formed. You know who the Republicans were in the South? The poor whites that were disenfranchised by slavery.
Yep. Yeah.
So when people say that the party switched sides, or there was a Southern strategy, or there was these Dixiecrat people that were this en masse, or somehow the South became this racist bastion of conservative thought, Republicans have been in the South from day one. They were the people that were disenfranchised by the slaves that were held by the Democrats. That's the history the Democrats didn't want you to learn. The reason why they tore down all those statues over the last 5 years, and the reason why they were so busy trying to cover up their own sins of the past, because they are the problem in America across almost every single spectrum when it comes to human oppression and the destruction of civil rights and the destruction of people as a whole.
Yep. Absolutely. I laugh. I chuckle inside when I see liberals tearing down Confederate statues.
Yeah, it's their history.
Knowing that history, I'm like,
Yeah.
are you kidding me?
Well, and I made a post. I called it I call them the trans Democrats, right? Because I moved back to Indiana in 2019 from Washington State,
Hmm.
and I see these people around here flying the flag of the Northern Army of Virginia, General Lee's Confederate flag, right? And I called these folks trans Democrats because I said you can pretend to be a conservative, but when we see this flag, we know what you really are, right? Because they're posers, they're pretenders, they're traitors and losers, and that's what that flag represents, especially in the North.
Yeah, yeah.
And then
Definitely.
we can also have a conversation about how the KKK used that flag from 1873, I believe, up to the present day,
Yep.
right?
Absolutely.
That I've never heard one person from the southern side of things that claims that flag represents southern heritage objecting to the use of that flag by the KKK,
Yep.
right? If it's about heritage, it's about southern rights and states' rights and all this other stuff, then
Hmm.
why wouldn't you defend it from being used by a group that's flat out racist?
Well, it just goes back to your synthesis of common sense.
Mm-hmm.
There's no standards.
Correct.
There's no standards there, and
There are now.
there are now.
Because we established them. When
We
I
established-
published that book last year, they were published. Right?
But they're
It-
not living by any standards.
Well,
by-
that's going to take a cultural shift. I just wrote the book last September. It's only been out for a year. And so to get people to gravitate towards that knowledge and say, all right, what are the standards for common sense? Because
Mhm.
I wrote it with the knowledge that, if you look at history from Voltaire, who said common sense is not so common, right?
Mhm.
That was in the 1700s. And so when you look at everything that we know about common sense, everyone assumes that it exists because of the use of the word common, but it is not common, right? Because of the very fact that it's seen as a facetious joke by most people, right?
Mhm.
I mean, it's
Mhm.
common sense, right? You hear that all the time, but no one really uses it. So in the army, we learn, or in the military, as a leader, you learn that there's a couple things. And one is what you don't inspect won't get done. And the other one is what you don't inspect to standard won't get done properly. Okay?
Mhm.
So you want something done right, you have to have a standard against which you measure that effectiveness, and then you have to check on it and make sure that it's being done right,
Mhm.
right? So that's why I established those four fundamental elements of common sense, when those are critical thinking, standards, virtue, and information. And information can be broken down into discerning between good and bad information, right? Virtue is essential because that's what tells you the difference between right and wrong. If you can't tell that, you're going to be lost across the board.
You can
Your stand-
almost, when I look at the synthesis of common sense and the four elements, you can
Correct.
also, and this is just my interpretation, you can substitute common sense for conservatism.
Yeah,
Because-
yeah, absolutely. Well, and when I sent you the video of Phil Robertson with Duck Dynasty, and he made a point that was poignant to me in every single part of the writing of that book. How can you talk about common sense without invoking Jesus Christ,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Jesus Christ was one of the people that actually went and challenged the Pharisees, the religious leaders of his day, and he asks them very simple common sense questions that challenge everything they say, and he challenges it in less than 10 words in a sentence, right? He
Mm-hmm.
said, and it's amazing, that people don't grasp this. Albert Einstein said it, and I always say it: simplicity is genius, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you can't explain something simply, you don't know enough about the subject.
Yeah.
And so when Christ came and was actually talking with the Pharisees and asking them simple questions about the things they believed in, such as, can you heal a man on the Sabbath? Well, which is greater for the glory of God? To judge a man for doing a righteous act, right? Or
Mhm.
actually doing the righteous act? Which one has more importance,
Mhm.
right? So are you doing good or are you complaining about someone else doing good? Which one has more merit? Right?
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
those are the simple kind of comparisons that we have to just look at and say, there's so much wisdom in that entire scenario that most people don't even grasp it at face value because they're like, how does that apply to me? Right?
Yeah.
But the reality is if you're not doing good on a daily basis, you won't see that. And that's why discerning between good and evil is so important, because if you don't have virtue, you will never understand the value of good information over bad information. You will never value standards. And critical thinking then is completely lost on you because there's no way you can think when you're so busy feeling because you're trying to overcome the guilt complex you have by doing all the wrong things all the time.
Where are we, speaking of good versus evil,
Mm.
where are we in the culture war? Because um, it seems like, patriotic Americans are waging the war back now, and
Starting to, yeah.
starting to a little bit. It happens in. I read this book. I want to say a couple of years ago. It's called Pendulum, and it speaks to the direction of not only the culture but a lot of different things swinging like every 40 or so years, and it seems like it happened. You saw it with Barry Goldwater, and then
Right.
I'm talking about politics, but then
Mm-hmm.
it bubbles up in the culture. You saw it with Ronald Reagan, and then you saw it with Newt Gingrich and the Contract of America. Then you saw it with Fox News, and Rush Limbaugh.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then now you have, all of these conservative, podcasts and radio show hosts, and now you have conservative outlets like Red State Radio, and you have all of these different venues at Newsmax TV,
Mm-hmm.
One America News. So it seems like a war is being waged now. What's your opinion on where we are in the culture war and how we're doing?
I definitely agree with a pendulum paradigm. I think that we shift back and forth. Um, when before the Barry Goldwater era of the 60s, right? Barry Goldwater was instrumental in actually getting Ronald Reagan to convert over from the Democrat to becoming more of a libertarian, thinker, but a Republican in by definition, right? And so that shift started when you look at the 60s revolution and the hippies, okay? Everything that the folks that were burning down cities um, during the course of the Obama era and then also during the Trump era, but less during that time, right? When you look at those protests, they used the inspiration from the 60s protests as
Mm-hmm.
their source of inspiration for what they did, but they took it to the next level. So when you look at a pendulum shift, the one thing that's most dangerous about a pendulum shift is that if you allow the extremes to become mainstream, the pendulum swings farther and farther both ways until catastrophe occurs,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's where we're at, is we're actually swinging back towards a pendulum shift that leans more right because the election in Virginia was clearly a referendum on the stupidity of leftist culture, okay?
Mm-hmm.
Cancel culture, telling parents they had no rights over what their kids were taught in school, CRT, all the different things that they try to make these shows that are doing it for all the right reasons, but if it's leftist, it's already for the wrong reason, no matter what they say, because their solutions are always wrong-headed, even if they have good intentions. I always say that too. Good intentions don't matter, only the outcomes, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the only time intentions matter to someone like me is to determine motive in a crime case, right? So when you look at the pendulum swinging, we
Mm-hmm.
had the hippie movement. We had all that nonsense in the 70s. Everybody started getting high and taking LSD and doing all this other stuff, the swinging and the sex orgies and the key parties and all the other crap. Now, what was the outcome of all of that stuff in the 60s, the free love movement? Well, lo and behold, having sex creates babies. So what do? They decided to implement abortion in 1973. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
the institution of abortion was a direct response to adult irresponsibility in the 60s. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
so because we had people that were producing children out of wedlock, or people that were producing children at their swinger parties, or people that were just flat out departed from biblical understanding and context of marriage and relationship,
Mm-hmm.
we started creating children out of wedlock that people didn't want to pay for. So they said, well, instead of facing up to my responsibilities or holding myself accountable so I don't make those mistakes, let's just kill the problem.
Mm-hmm.
That's how abortion was created. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
so once that happened, we kind of went towards you had Jimmy Carter and his little feel-good narrative, but horrible solutions. Everybody was like, that doesn't seem like we're headed in the right direction. So they pulled back, and that created the conservative 80s under Reagan, where
Mm-hmm.
we regained our purpose and sense of direction as a nation, and we rebounded economically. We rebounded on a cultural level in some regards, right? And I was a kid back then. I didn't understand politics at all, and
Mm-hmm.
I knew that my dad, for the few years that I was around him, he did not like Ronald Reagan.
Mm-hmm.
Well, as I got older, I realized that the vast majority of my family is actually liberal.
Mm-hmm.
And all of a sudden, the reasons why I didn't get along with them really sprang into focus, right?
Yeah. Yep.
So
Yep.
the cultural clash is something that will always have a pendulum swing to it, because there's the ebb and flow of generational context and people seeing what their parents did and the people around them, and then saying, I either want to go with that or I want to reject that. And unless there are penalties that force them to reject it, as long as there's no punitive measure taken for the things that they do, the pendulum will continue to swing out farther and farther until something catastrophic happens to where we fall off the cliff,
I
right?
think. Well, I think when you look at, you were talking about the pendulum swing and the
Mhm.
extremes being the mainstream. I think during the Obama years, especially those last couple of years when things started to get really bad, I
Right.
think conservatives and people that were patriotic Americans and even some independents were looking for that Overton window. They were looking for, that spectrum of ideas that were different from liberalism, that to, whether it be public policy, whether it be social issues,
Right.
that were come to come back into the mainstream. They're looking for those values, those virtues, and
Right.
those things that we used to hold really sacred.
I would actually argue that that began to happen in 2010 with the takeover of the Congress,
Yeah, yeah,
right? That,
absolutely.
that big title turn, just 2 short years into Obama's turn, and we're like, whoa,
Yep,
wrong path. Let's
yep.
go back to where we were, right? And
Immediately wrong path.
exactly, and we all knew it. But the problem with the silent majority is that they're too comfortable, right? They use silence as they call it maintaining the higher road, but there is no higher road when you're being constantly bombarded and assaulted by evil.
Yeah,
There's
this is
just no
war.
yeah, there's no higher road to be had. At this
Hmm.
point, we have to step up and say, that's enough. Shut up. Sit down. We're done talking to you,
Yep,
right?
yep.
And we have to just look at these folks and treat them like the juvenile mindset that they are, because there's no way you can have a serious conversation with someone who looks down between their legs and sees a male body part and says, you know what, I'm going to pretend to be a girl today. You
Yep.
don't have rational conversations with people like that, nor people who support them, right?
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
you read my part in the book about the Jerry Springer Society, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Okay, but that is exactly what we have. When you have people that are unwilling to stand up for the right things, and yet they look at their fellow man failing and doing everything the worst possible way, and they take pleasure in seeing that, and they breathe a sigh of relief and say, "Whew, at least my life isn't as bad as that person." Okay,
Mhm.
what you've done is you created a context under which you can excuse your own faults and failures as long as they're not as bad as the next person.
That's true.
So
That is
instead of
very true.
holding yourself accountable and saying, I need to do better, you just say, well, I'm not as bad as that guy, so I can keep doing what I'm doing. Okay? And that Jerry Springer mentality, combined with the apathy that is bred by the silence and the assumption that the people who are right have the largest majority and eventually will just speak up. Well, someday never comes, right? There's songs about that.
Hmm.
Someday's already here. It's actually already past us, and we're still sitting on the sidelines waiting for some hero to come and save us. Okay,
Yeah.
and that's extremely dangerous because that's the position that Donald Trump was put in. He's one man.
Yeah.
Donald Trump by himself is not going to save this country. It's
Yeah.
going to take everyone working together with a concerted effort that says, you know what? Enough of this crap. It's time to cancel the cancel culture. It's time to stop all these little crybaby whiners and sob sisters. Shut up. Go sit down. We're going to make adult decisions for the adult people in this nation. If you want to play pretend with all your little nonsense, go do that on your own time. That is no longer public policy. That is not what we are going to endorse and support for this nation.
And that was a good point you just made because Trump was unfairly put in that position. And, I can understand, after and it's been more so it's not just he people were looking for a champion to champion the ideas that he put forth into the public square,
Right.
but also they're fed up with the Republican Party because the Republicans weren't
Yep.
spinelessness,
Yep.
not standing for anything, not defending the Constitution, not putting the country's interests at first, but they were just kind of fed up with the status quo. But that is a very good point
Right.
about Trump and how he was unfairly put in that position because
Right.
one guy isn't going to shoulder the load, even with 2 terms.
Correct. And he actually did a yeoman's job. I will be honest with you. I mean, you saw my Facebook post back in 2016. I was not sold on Donald Trump as even a Republican candidate until
Me
he picked
neither.
Mike Pence as a VP, right?
Yep,
I'm like,
exactly.
this guy has been Mr. Hollywood Celebrity Apprentice. You're fired. Let me do all these pageants and silly stuff. And, he's the gambling guy. He's the guy that promotes all the boxing events in Vegas. He's been in rap videos. He is Mr. Hollywood. He's Mr. Leftist. They all adored him until he ran as a Republican, right?
Mhm.
Right? He
Mhm.
used to hang out with Oprah and Al Sharpton and Jesse Jackson and all those guys. I mean, he would be that guy. I mean, if you flash back 12 years ago, he was hanging out with the Snoop Dogg's of the world, right? And
Well,
even in 2008, Barack Obama said the American dream is Donald Trump.
well, not only that, John, Trump received countless awards from minority organizations.
Correct, because he did fantastic work in helping them, right? And that's the thing is that everyone that's why I say the leftists cannot have a rational conversation because everything for them is emotionally based, and they do not have the capacity to do critical thinking.
Yep.
Because if they did, they would look at everything that he had done prior to 2016 and say, okay, this guy may have some merit in what he's saying. What's he actually saying? And challenge that not on the fact that he issues East Coast tweets, but the fact that he actually is the guy that says we've got problems here. Let's challenge him head on.
Mhm.
And he was absolutely right in challenging the things that he did, and in some ways, even the way he did it, it set a new standard for at least public interaction and just an honest slap in the face to a very biased media corporation that
Mhm.
does not have America's best interests at heart.
Mhm. You think he coming back?
I don't know. I mean, honestly, if he comes back, I would like to be somewhere on his advisor team, right? Because I sent my book to Mike Lindell and his COO, right?
Mhm.
And I wanted to get some stuff going with them, and they never contacted me back. They went off on the voting corruption scandal and all that stuff. Mike Lindell got busy and everything else. But if Trump runs again or whoever else is out there, they need to pull around them a think tank of people who are legitimately conservative that espouse the correct ideals and can articulate these things in business solution, in moral solution, in documented understanding of scientific relationships, human behavior, and understanding how to manage things on a large scale spectrum that make sure that the majority of the country is not disenfranchised, but that a good solution is put forth as the best option.
Mhm.
And so we've got to be smart. We need Republicans to grow a spine and develop solutions. Between now and 2024, that has to happen, or the Republican Party is as dead as the Democratic Party is, because the
Yeah.
Democratic Party is imploding right now. You've got the socialists and all the far left whatever you want to call them. I don't have any nice words for them, so I'll just keep them quiet. But you've got those folks that are out there, and they are doing their level best to undermine and destroy everything about the Democratic Party and re-image it into the new American Socialist Party. Okay, they want socialism here because socialism enables them, because they're in the seat of power. They get a benefit at everyone else's expense. That's always their game. Anytime you hear a leftist talking, that's always their game. They want power over other people so that they can benefit and not have to work nearly as hard.
That's right.
Yep. Okay. AOC wants to be a queen, right? That's who she is. All those people around her, and there's yeah. Yeah. So that's what they want. They want power over everybody else so that they can benefit and proclaim that in true Democratic Party fashion. Oh, this is for your betterment, right? This is for your greater good. You follow us, and we're going to be your heroes, your champions. We're going to be the people. I mean, look at what they've done with the black vote since they. We never finished the progression of the Democratic Party into the modern day. So the Democratic Party was the party of slavery. Okay. There was not a single Jim Crow law ever written by a Republican. So everything during the Reconstruction era, all the way up through the 1960s, everything that disenfranchised black people, gave them separate and unequal things such as education, diners, bus places, water fountains, everything that was part of that process was all Democratic run. 1964 happens, and the Civil Rights Act was born, right? JFK wrote it, Lyndon B. Johnson implemented it, okay? So what happened was the Democrats decided to capitalize on that momentum and say, oh, the country is making a shift. We need to shift with it because apparently hanging people and burning crosses in their front yard has lost its appeal. Okay.
Yeah.
and I say that sarcastically, but that was exactly what was on their minds. They'd run out of tolerance for violently assaulting other people that didn't agree with them. Decided instead to use division, using the categories and classifications of the protected classes under that Title IX or Title X Civil Rights Act, right? So sex, gender, race, religion, all those things. They decided they were going to divide and conquer by oppressing people, right? Or promoting the notion that they were oppressed, and then claiming to be the champion of the oppressed so that they would get their votes, okay? So the Democrats in just a short decade, now the last person lynched by the KKK was in 1982, I believe, okay?
Yep, that's
so
correct.
They were still active 20 years later, right? But for the most part, that kind of treatment by the Democrats against the citizens of the United States had fallen out of favor. And so what they did was they decided they were going to become the heroes of the people that they, just 30 years earlier, were the ones doing all of the oppressing for.
Yep.
Right?
Yeah.
And that's the crazy part. They went from being the oppressors to being the champions of the oppressed, but they knew everything to say because they had actually been the ones doing the oppressing from the get-go.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's a shame that people don't see that for what it is, because if you understood that, you would never vote Democrat again. Especially if you're a person of color, a person who's been disenfranchised, you would never vote for them for any reason ever again, because that's exactly who they are.
Yep, exactly. Wow, good stuff, man. Thanks for laying that out, man. You gave my audience a lot of
common sense.
Oh man, a lot of common sense, a lot of conservatism too.
Yes.
So we got to have you back on, man. So
absolutely.
So we can keep going, man. But thanks for coming on, folks. Go out, get his book, Common Sense: A 2020 Perspective. I bought it on Kindle, so and I'm deep into it now. I think I'm at the end pretty much now, so I'm gonna reread it again because this is the language of conservatism, folks. This is basically the best description of the book that I have. This is the language of conservatism, and it's plain, it's common sense, and it's easy to understand and read. Get your kids reading it.
Right. Yeah, and some of the concepts I tried to write it for a level that everyone could understand, because I use words and I talk fast, but there's something to be said for just keeping it simple. And I tried to keep it simple, and I even laid it out. What did you think about the critical thinking process? That process map that I put in there.
Oh yeah, that process map is amazing.
Right? And think about that. With just a simple diagram, you can put into a baseline format pretty much the standard process for every single critical thinking exercise you could have. You're going to have
Mm-hmm.
deviations from that, right? There's going to be special considerations and everything else, but that basic process, if you learn how to coach your mind and follow that general format, you become a critical thinker by default on every single thing you face.
Mm-hmm.
That's
Mm-hmm.
how I think. That's how I think naturally, right?
Yep.
That
Yep.
was that was that was my first draft of that process map.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah,
That's amazing.
I did it in one shot. I sent it to my editors and people that were helping me write the book, and they're like, "I don't have any comments on this. It looks good." I was like,
That's
"Wait,
awesome.
what?" So, yeah. So, I mean, if we can help people with the information and teaching them how to step up and grab their standards and say, "This is what we are going to stand for, and it's going to be for the right reasons with virtue and
Mm-hmm.
honor and integrity." We've got to get back to those basics because right now we're being exploited because we don't stand. So,
Absolutely.
yeah, the silent majority no longer has the latitude to remain silent. We have to roar like the lions we're supposed to be.
Amen. So we're gonna leave it at that. Thanks, John. Thanks a lot, man. I really appreciate it. We got, like I said, we're gonna have you back on.
I appreciate it. I look forward to it. Yeah.
This is The Cure.